This is not a belt. This is compressed knowledge. The Lielvārde belt has been studied for over a century. Historians call it ornament. Ethnographers call it tradition. But look closer. These are not random patterns. They repeat with structure. They scale with precision. They form sequences that behave like code. The belt contains dozens of distinct geometric symbols arranged in highly ordered patterns. These patterns may represent a system of encoded information, not just decoration. A wearable structure designed to store and transmit knowledge across generations. Not written, not carved, but woven into something you carry on your body. So the real question isn't what it is. It's this. What were they trying to remember that we forgot?
The Lielvārdes belt didn't appear by accident. It comes from a specific place in Latvia, Lielvārde, a region layered with myth, ritual, and continuity. What we have today is a 19th century version. But patterns like these don't emerge overnight. The belt stretches over 3 meters and contains around 22 to 24 distinct geometric symbols. They repeat in sequences, not randomly, but with control. You see symmetry, mirroring, alternation, compression and expansion. This is not how humans decorate. This is how humans encode. Because decoration optimizes for beauty, but encoding optimizes for consistency. And consistency is what allows information to survive time. So either dozens of weavers across generations just happened to repeat the same precise structures, or they were following something already defined. A transmitted system, learned, preserved, and executed without being formally written. Not a pattern you invent, a pattern you inherit.
Baltic cultures are often described as pre-literate, as if knowledge simply wasn't stored. That's convenient and wrong. Knowledge in Baltic societies was transmitted with extreme precision through rhythm, repetition, and structure. The dinas alone contain hundreds of thousands of lines, preserved across generations with minimal variation. That level of stability doesn't happen by accident. It requires systems. In sound, that system was rhythm, meter, repetition. But sound fades. So what happens when you want something to last longer than memory? You move from time into space, from sequence into structure. Geometry doesn't forget. It doesn't improvise. It doesn't drift over generations. A line stays a line. A pattern stays exact. The same logic used to stabilize knowledge in song was translated into visual form, not replacing sound, but anchoring it.
The belt wasn't hung on a wall. It wasn't stored in a chest. It was worn. The Lielvārdes belt was wrapped tightly around the waist, the physical center of the body. In traditional Latvian dress, the belt secured clothing, supported posture, and signaled identity, status, region, belonging. But function alone doesn't explain placement. If this were only decoration, it could exist anywhere, on sleeves, on hems, on visible surfaces. But this stays close, aligned, fixed around the core. And the core is not random. It's where balance is controlled, where movement begins, where tension is held. A structure not meant to be observed at a distance, but integrated. Something you don't just look at, but live inside. a system that doesn't sit outside the human. It completes it.
If this were unique to the Baltics, it would be easier to dismiss. But it isn't. Across the world, cultures developed ways to store information without writing it down. The Inca quipu used knotted strings to encode numerical and possibly narrative data. Each knot had position, tension, and spacing, variables that carried meaning. In Mesoamerica, Mayan glyphs combined symbols into layered visual structures, part image, part language, part system. Different continents, no direct contact, yet the same principle appears. Information doesn't need letters, it needs structure. Not written linearly, but organized spatially. Human cultures, separated by oceans, converged on the same solution: to compress knowledge into patterns the mind can recognize, without needing to read. Because reading is learned, but pattern recognition is instinct.
We tend to look at ancient symbols as decoration, single signs, isolated meanings. That's the mistake. Because systems don't live in symbols, they live in relationships. In the Inca quipu, a single knot means almost nothing on its own. Its meaning depends on position, sequence, and relation to other knots. The same applies to Mayan glyphs. Individual elements combine into clusters, modifying, amplifying, or redefining each other. So the unit is not the symbol, it's the pattern. Now look again at the Lielvārdes josta. The symbols don't just repeat, they interact, they shift order, they mirror, they compress into dense segments, then expand into open space. This isn't a collection of meanings, it's a grammar. A rule-based system where position, sequence, and variation create information. Not a language you read left to right, a structure you decode as a whole.
So why go through all this effort? Why build systems out of knots, glyphs, or woven patterns? Why not just write things down? Because writing is fragile. Written language requires infrastructure, materials, literacy, institutions. Take that away, and the system collapses. But patterns don't need schools. They don't need translation. They can be remembered by the body, repeated through practice, recognized without explanation. And more importantly, they can be hidden in plain sight. A text can be burned, a scroll can be lost, but a pattern woven into daily life, it survives. These systems weren't just about storing information, they were about protecting it. Embedding knowledge into objects, clothing, rituals, making it inseparable from life itself. So it can't be erased, only forgotten.
We assume information is something you read, but that's a modern bias. For most of human history, knowledge wasn't external. It wasn't stored out there. It was embedded in perception itself. Human cognition is built for pattern recognition. We don't process the world as isolated data points, but as shapes, contrasts, and relationships. Before language, there was form. Before text, there was structure. So what happens when information is designed not to be read, but to be seen? Or even more precisely, to be recognized? The Lielvārdes josta doesn't explain itself. It doesn't guide you step by step. It presents a field of relationships, and your mind tries to resolve it. The belt may not be a storage device in the modern sense, but an interface, a system that activates meaning only when perception is trained to engage with it today.
In 1799, soldiers discovered the Rosetta Stone. One object, 3 scripts, and suddenly a lost language could be decoded. We like this story because it suggests something comforting, that all knowledge is just waiting for the right key. The Rosetta Stone allowed scholars to translate Egyptian hieroglyphs by comparing them to known Greek text. But translation is not understanding. You can decode words without inheriting the mind that created them. You can read the symbols and still miss the system. So what if the problem isn't that we lack the key? What if we no longer recognize the lock? Systems like the Lielvārdes josta may not be unreadable. They may be unrecognizable to a perception shaped by linear thinking.
Modern systems store information outside the body, in books, in servers, in clouds you never see. Ancient systems often did the opposite. They embedded knowledge into behavior, into repetition, into form. Not something you access, something you become. Human physiology responds to pattern, visual rhythm, symmetry, repetition, can influence attention, emotional state, even bodily alignment. This is measurable, not mystical. So what happens when a structured pattern is placed directly on the body and worn daily, aligned with movement, with breath, with tension and release? The Lielvārdes josta was not just storing information, it was reinforcing it, turning abstract structure into lived experience. Not a code you decode once, but a system that gradually reshapes how you perceive, move, and organize reality itself.
So, what is the Lielvārdes belt? Not just a cultural artifact, not just a pattern, but a system, a way of compressing knowledge into structure and embedding it into life. We saw the origins. We saw the parallels. We saw how perception itself becomes the interface. So the question is no longer what it means. It's this. What kind of mind creates something like this? A mind that doesn't separate knowledge from living, that doesn't store information, but organizes reality. The belt is not a message from the past. It's evidence of a different way of thinking, one that doesn't need writing, because it never leaves the human.
So how do you read something like this? You don't start with meaning. You start with attention. Look for repetition. Look for symmetry. Look for where patterns break and where they intensify. Don't ask, what does this symbol mean? Ask, what changes when this appears? Where does it sit? What comes before it? What follows? All complex systems, from language to code, depend on relationships, not isolated elements. So treat it like a system, not a picture. The more you observe structure, the more structure your mind begins to see. And at some point, something shifts. Not in the belt, in you.
This is not a belt. This is compressed knowledge. But not all knowledge is meant to be stored. Some of it is meant to be lived. So maybe the ancients didn't just create patterns. Maybe they created systems that shape the ones who carry them. And maybe the real loss wasn't the code, but the ability to recognize that it was never just decoration.